It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mete. President Trump has confirmed he's shutting down the CIA program that arms rebels fighting the Assad regime in Syria. Trump made the admission in a tweet criticizing the Washington Post, which first broke the story. The covert program began in 2013 under President Obama. At its peak, it cost the CIA a reported $1 billion a year. But instead of helping vetted groups, many weapons ended up in the hands of jihadists also fighting Assad. Trump's decision is seen as a major victory for the Assad regime and a signal the U.S. no longer seeks its removal. So what does it mean for the Syrian conflict? Well, I'm joined now by two guests. Nader Hashemi is director at the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. His latest book, Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. And Max Blumenthal is a best-selling author and senior editor for Alternet's Grayzone project. Welcome to you both. Max, I'll start with you. You've been a critic of the initiative to arm and train Syrian rebels for a long time now. What's your reaction to Trump apparently ordering the program's closure?
Well, I think this might be the only good thing Donald Trump has done, maybe in his life, certainly as president, although triggering the resignation of Victoria Nuland from the State Department was also a good thing. But the arming and training of Syrian rebels, supposedly moderate rebels, under the umbrella of the CIA with funding by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, two countries that are exporting an explicitly anti-democratic agenda, is one of the greatest scandals of our time that no one talks about. And we can see the results of it in Idlib, one of the last strongholds of the anti-government Syrian rebels. It's now substantially controlled by the largest franchise of al-Qaeda since 9/11. It is a place where the anti-democratic ideology that is very similar to the ideology that prevails in ISIS-controlled Raqqa is in control. And this is a direct result of the CIA creating and funding the Free Syrian Army, which, as Sam Heller of the Century Foundation finally concluded last week, was simply serving as backfill for al-Qaeda and ISIS. And we can go back to 2013 when the arms started really flowing in to the Free Syrian Army under Operation Timber Sycamore. And look at what happened at Meneg Air Base when the FSA's lead commander, General Jamal al-Qaidi, after doing a press conference with the fake U.S. ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, worked hand in glove with Omar Shishani, Omar the Chechen, a CIA-trained jihadist who is commanding an ISIS battalion, to take the airbase, gave a press conference with ISIS, and basically celebrated alongside ISIS. The FSA has worked hand in glove with ISIS. They've worked closely with Jabhat al-Nusra, including to take Raqqa and help set the stage for the de facto capital of ISIS's caliphate. They have presented nothing good for Syrians. They've triggered a counter-escalation, as everyone from Secretary of State John Kerry to Joe Biden has acknowledged, by Russia and Iran. Basically, the Syrian government was forced to call on its allies to prevent black flags from flying over Damascus. And this was what took place after Idlib was taken. So you have a disastrous program put into place by the CIA of funding death squads, just as the CIA had in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. The proxy war will have long-term effects that will haunt us for a generation. We now know that Salman Abedi, the Manchester bomber, was not only trained in Libya, but in Syria as well. And we need to start asking supporters of the opposition and supporters of this disastrous and scandalous and dangerous program, what do they think the program of the Syrian opposition is? Do they even have a program? Which leader would have come into power if the Syrian government was ousted? How would this have been different from Iraq, from Libya, or from what we saw take place in the early 90s in Afghanistan? And honestly, I have never heard a coherent answer from those people.
Nader Hashemi, a lot of issues raised there. What's your take on Trump ending this program?
Well, I think in the big picture of the humanitarian, moral, and political crisis that has characterized the conflict in Syria over the past 6 years, the cutting of the funding is really insignificant in terms of shaping the contours of this conflict. I mean, I disagree with Mac's analysis that the rise and expansion of radical Salafi extremism in the form of ISIS or Al Qaeda is a byproduct of CIA funding of rebel groups, and that's why they've expanded to dominate the rebel opposition. I think the fundamental roots of this conflict are located in Damascus, are located in the policies of the Assad regime, which chose to respond to a peaceful uprising in the context of the Arab Spring with merciless brutality, leading to the worst state-sanctioned mass atrocities of the 21st century, and generating a mass politicide that has killed approximately 500,000 people, created the worst refugee crisis in the last 25 years. And out of that mayhem and out of those policy choices by the regime in Damascus, backed by its allies in Moscow and Tehran, we have the gradual emergence of a radical Salafi extremism in the form of Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and then ISIS. And the conflict sort of takes on the contours that it did today. You can't explain the level of violence, the human rights abuses, the mass atrocities which have been copiously documented by pointing to Barack Obama's very half-hearted sort of attempt to have influence over the battlefield in Syria by funding through the CIA a group of rebels that were supposedly, to be vetted. I mean, that's, I think, a fundamental, misreading of the roots of this conflict, particularly the connection and the role that radical Salafi extremism has played in the war in Syria.
But Nader, it's not just the U.S. who people point to, right? It's also the Gulf states and Turkey. And let me ask you, I mean, do you think it's fair to make a distinction between the initial phase of the Syrian war, when you had Assad cracking down on, many peaceful protests, and the second phase when you have all these countries, the Gulf states and Turkey especially, deciding to intervene and turning this into a bloody proxy war, which changes the equation?
You're right. I mean, after the, roughly into the second year of the war, you had intervening countries. The Gulf states, Turkey, were there trying to advance their own national interests. But if you look at it from the perspective of human rights, if you look at it from the perspective of the mass atrocities, if you look at it from the perspective of those atrocities cannot be attributed to the Gulf states, to the role that Turkey played, to the CIA funding, not even to the role of these radical Salafi extremist groups who have committed mass atrocities, but nowhere in comparison to the role and the atrocities that have been unleashed by the Assad regime backed by Russia and Iran. In that sense, there's absolutely no comparison whatsoever. So if you take human rights seriously and you're interested in trying to mitigate the human rights situation, then you have to focus on the policies of the Assad regime and its regional and international backers.
Max Blumenthal, if you could respond to that, especially the point there that there's no parity here between these two different sides.
Well, Nader didn't answer any of the key questions about who would come into power if the Syrian government were ousted, nor did he explain what the Syrian opposition's agenda was, either from its inception or currently. And these are key questions that relate to the entire scope of the conflict. It's also simply false to say that the entire balance of atrocities is the result of Syrian government repression. Of course, the Syrian government has been massively repressive. But David Ignatius just reported this week, after Trump cut off the CIA program, quoting a senior US government official, bragging that over 100,000 Syrian government soldiers, who are mostly conscripts, regular guys from cities in Syria, from around Syria, were killed thanks to the CIA program. And it's not just the CIA program, it's a whole program operating under the umbrella of the operations room in Turkey and Jordan, which is funded by Qatar, by Saudi Arabia. We need to take the whole scope of this program into account. Just listen to what Joseph Biden said in 2014 in Harvard.
But my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens, thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world.
They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a Sunni-Shia war that they poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of tons of weapons. That's tens of thousands of tons of weapons. We're talking about an all-out proxy war on the sovereign state of Syria into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. So to deny that to really downplay this program and what the U.S. was doing with its Sunni allies in the Gulf and in Turkey is really to deny the impact that ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham have had on the everyday lives of Syrians. Northeastern University has done a peer-reviewed study of refugees and found that close to 50% of refugees said that they fled from the rebels. Of course, many also fled from Syrian government repression or from just general warfare, a combination of factors. Something like 7 million people have been internally displaced by this proxy war, and they fled into the safety of government territory. You have even the Qatari mouthpiece, Al Jazeera Plus, reporting this week that people are flooding back into Aleppo now that the Salafi jihadist rebels have been extricated thanks to the help that the Syrian government received from Russia. The same thing happened in Palmyra. IHS Janes, the esteemed military think tank, has referred to the Syrian army as the anvil against ISIS. And yes, the Syrian government is using Vietnam-era weapons to suppress a Salafi jihadist insurgency and prevent the same scenario that took hold in Libya and Afghanistan from taking place in the heart of the Middle East. And so there have been massive atrocities. Nobody's denying that. But if this program had never come into place, if the neocon program of regime change in Syria was never put into place under the cover of the Arab Spring and behind the false narrative of humanitarian interventionism, this war would have never been escalated and hundreds of thousands of people would still be alive.
Well, look,
can
I respond to some of that,
Please.
Aaron?
Please.
Well, first of all, I'd be happy to respond to the questions that Max posed to me. But my understanding is that Aaron is the moderator of this discussion, not Max Blumenthal. So there's a lot of...
So you can't answer them.
I'd be happy to answer it.
Yeah, Nader, obviously, please, go ahead.
Let me turn to Aaron and ask what he'd like me to focus on, because there's been a lot of distortion, a lot of myth, and a lot of just blatant sort of misinformation here. So Aaron, since you're the moderator, I'd love to respond to all of these falsehoods that we're hearing from Max Blumenthal. Tell me which one you'd like me to respond to.
I have no dominion over this debate, and nor do I know, or at least at this point, can identify what is a falsehood or not. So whatever you feel like responding to, please go ahead.
Okay, well, Max, quoted Joe Biden, and he quoted David Ignatius sort of as being sort of people we should turn to understand what's happening in this conflict. I would encourage the listeners of this debate to turn to Amnesty International, to turn to Human Rights Watch, to turn to the UN Special Commission of Inquiry that has looked into the violence in Syria and has produced collectively, those three human rights organizations, over 60 reports that clearly spell out who is responsible, who the greatest perpetrator of the atrocities has been over the last 6 years. And the overwhelming bulk of the evidence can be laid at the doorstep of the Assad regime, not the radical Salafi jihadists that are also a huge problem, but they're not a problem from a human rights perspective when you compare them to the policies of the the Assad regime. That's simply a factual and objective, I think, question that anyone who wants to look at the documentary and human rights record, can come to that conclusion. Nader Pillay, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, specifically said that you cannot compare the atrocities in Syria. So Max Blumenthal wants to continue to compare them, and he wants to quote Joe Biden and David Ignatius of the Washington Post as authorities on this particular topic. Well, that's fine. He can do that. But I think if you care about human rights and you care about mitigating and stopping the mass atrocities that have characterized this conflict over the last 6 years, then you have to try and restrain the party that's been largely responsible for perpetrating them in ways that do not have any comparison. And that's the Assad regime, backed by Russia, backed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's the big picture. Now, we can go into talking about the problem of radical jihadism, the problem of where they're getting their weapons, why they've become such a dominant sort of force, and to what extent one can connect that to U.S. foreign policy. That would be a subject, I think, for an entire program. And if you want me to go there, I'd be happy to clear it.
That's the subject for this debate. Hello?
Yeah, well, then why did you ask me about, if it's the subject of the debate, Max, why did you ask me about who's going to take over if Assad is toppled? That's not the subject of the debate, so you can't pick and choose. Tell me what the subject of the debate is, Max, and stick to it, and I'm happy to debate you.
It's pretty clear that you can't answer that question, even though that was the agenda. The agenda behind arming the rebels. The agenda behind arming the rebels was a transition, moving the Syrian government out, and it would have been absolutely disastrous. David Ignatius and Joe Biden, by the way, share what appears to be your position, which is regime change, but even they can't answer the question of who would have come into power in Damascus, what would have happened to the 40% of Syria's population who are facing down a genocide.
Well, let me tell you, Max.
But Nader, let me ask you.
I'm happy to quote Human Rights Watch on what the rebels have done, as well as other sources like the pro-opposition Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which has also found that over 100,000 people have been killed on the government side. But the point remains, Nader, that since the U.S. and its Sunni allies, who have an explicitly anti-democratic agenda in Syria, which is not shared by the majority of Syrians who would prefer a pluralistic society, if this program had never been put into place, we wouldn't be talking about all these atrocities. The U.S. and these other groups, these other countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and professors at the University of Denver have no place to dictate what should take place inside a sovereign country. And I want to ask you, since the debate is ostensibly about arming the rebels, do you favor and support the cutoff of arms to the Syrian rebels?
I support the cutoff of the arms to all of those factors, all of those forces, militias, political organizations that are responsible for atrocities in Syria, whether those atrocities are coming from rebel groups, through funding of the CIA, or through support from the Islamic Republic of Iran and Russia. Those are sort of two countries that seem to be completely devoid of any sort of consideration in your analysis. There seems to be no, I think, understanding of the role, the criminal role, the catastrophic role that they've played in Syria in terms of shaping the contours of the human rights catastrophe. So I'm willing to go across the board in terms of stopping intervention from outside powers. I think that would be a fair and objective way of proceeding, but it doesn't seem like that's something that you are concerned about when it comes to intervention. It's only the role of the United States in this conflict that seems to concern you. But I think if one wants to look at it on balance, the role of Russia, the role of Iran has been far more significant, far more catastrophic, and far more important in terms of shaping the contours of this conflict, particularly if you take the question of human rights seriously.
But Nader, let me ask you. Let me ask Nader a question, Max, about Iran.
Quickly about Russia.
All right, go ahead, and I'll ask my question. Go ahead, sure.
Well, I've heard Nader's point again and again from, at least in public, from the State Department, and it's flax. But in private, what the Secretary of State John Kerry said to the Syrian opposition was that the reason Russia intervened in Syria was because the U.S. was simply watching ISIS and Al Qaeda advance. They were moving towards Damascus. They were moving towards the coast, and Russia intervened to prevent the collapse of the Syrian state. It intervened to prevent what happened in Libya, where Al Qaeda and various Islamist militias and ISIS are vying for control. It intervened to prevent the war of the warlords that we saw destroy half of Kabul in the 90s. So you can argue that Russia committed atrocities. I can't argue with that. But to say it's catastrophic is simply not true. It prevented the state collapse that you seem, and others, including the State Department, seem to have favored.
That's a complete distortion and warped, I think, interpretation of my position. I mean, I could sort of take that apart in so many ways, but I'm not sure how much time, Aaron, we have.
No,
here
Nader,
to
go ahead,
through these
because the role of Iran and Russia and the goals of the resistance axis, Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, is vital here. So yeah, please.
So what would you like me to respond to?
Well, the question is, Max is contending there that Russia's intervention helped stop the advance of jihadists who could have overrun Damascus.
Government should have cut and run. You're arguing that the government should have just simply cut and run and let the rebels take over. You can't say
no. See, I'm arguing fundamentally that when the uprising began in Syria after half a century of one family rule, Assad should have negotiated with the opposition to prevent the mass politicide that has characterized the war in Syria. That's what they should have done. You have no interest in the question of the roots of this conflict, the policies of the Assad regime, the support that they've gotten from Iran and Syria that have created the worst humanitarian crisis in this part of the world in arguably the last 25 years. Those issues don't matter to you. They certainly matter to me, and that just, I think, speaks to the fundamentally different value systems that informs our approach to this topic. So I think what the Assad regime should have done, it should have done that right from the beginning, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. In terms of Russia preventing the rise of radical extremism in the form of ISIS coming into Damascus, well, that's just false. I mean, if you look at the bombing raids that Russia was conducting when it first intervened in around September of 2015, overwhelmingly those bombing raids were not directed against ISIS targets. There's a lot of documentation. Or Al-Qaeda, they've been directed largely at Syrian rebels because the plan of Russia was to support the Assad regime, back it up, prevent it from falling. And even the Russian foreign minister has said that, look, it looked like the situation was working against Assad. We had to step up and we had to sort of, come in to rescue this regime. And if you look at just one example, when Aleppo was falling about 7 months ago, at the precise moment Aleppo was falling as a result of significant Russian and Iranian support, at that exact moment, ISIS was taking over the historic town of Palmyra. Did Russia lift a finger to stop that from happening? Absolutely not, because that's not the focus of Russia's intervention. It's supporting its ally in Damascus as a way of extending its international and regional influence.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
The whole reason Russia had to focus on eastern Aleppo, which had been taken by force by a collection of Salafi and Salafi jihadi militias in 5 neighborhoods in eastern Aleppo, implementing an anti-democratic program which abused actually local human rights activists. This is documented by Amnesty International. The reason they had to do that is to move on to the fight against ISIS. ISIS did take Palmyra after Russia took it in 2015 with the help of the Syrian army. And then it returned to the fight against ISIS in Palmyra and in Deir ez-Zor. No one talks about Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor is surrounded by ISIS and it's defended by the Syrian army. What has the U.S. done in Deir ez-Zor? It bombed the Syrian army. It claimed it was an accident. And this was to prevent coordination with the Russian military. But now we see ISIS being rolled back. We see Jabhat al-Nusra being rolled back. We see stabilization in Syria. We see, according to the United Nations, I know Nader likes to cite the UN, 440,000 internally displaced refugees have returned home this year, and tens of thousands of refugees from abroad are returning. It's the war that we have helped fueled with our anti-democratic Gulf allies that has created the refugee crisis that's driving the far right. And to put the blame entirely on the Syrian government for refusing to cut and run and allowing the catastrophe that befell Libya and Afghanistan to take place is the most propagandistic neoconservative talking point, and it needs to be blown out of the water.
Nader, let me ask you something.
These are slogans, Max. They're not serious analysis.
Nader, I have a question, just going back to what you were talking about, the roots of the conflict. So
Right.
Assad rejects the will of these tens of thousands of protesters who are demanding democratic reforms. He makes some gestures, but we all know that they come too late and they're not enough. But my question is, does that mean that he gives up the right to fight jihadist groups that are being funded by his regional enemies as well as the U.S.? I mean, the fact is, at a certain point, this conflict, however it started, it did become a proxy war.
Right. Well, during the first year of the war, Aaron, there was no ISIS in Syria. There was an emergence of radical Salafi jihadist groups, which increasingly got stronger over the course of the war, largely because of Gulf funding, but also because of the increasing reign of terror that Assad was unleashing over its own society. That sort of enveloping context created a ripe environment for radical extremists to do better recruiting, plus the funding that they were getting. So I think one has to sort of look at this in the context of the evolution of this particular conflict. To think that right now the choices that we have now between the Assad regime and a collection of these radical extremists, that is a result of decisions that were made by Damascus, by the international community, to stand on the sidelines while Assad crushed this peaceful and democratic uprising. And so it brought us to the horrific situation that we have today. But I think it's important to read the conflict forward rather than backwards. And what I mean from the evolution of how this conflict started, why it started, and how we can get to a situation where the Assad regime, which is, the fundamental perpetrator of the atrocities, is fundamentally to blame for this situation. To think, as Max does, that somehow we should celebrate the triumph of the Assad regime over all of Syria, and that the Assad regime now can be some sort of, I think he used the phrase, force for stabilization, is just wishful thinking. It's going to simply perpetuate this conflict for decades to come. To think for a moment that the person largely responsible for the vast majority of the atrocities, for a mass politicide, can be a source of stability and security in Syria is just wishful thinking. If that's what Max Blumenthal believes, he's entitled to believe that. But I think that's simply a recipe for further conflict in Syria and across the Middle East.
But Nader, look, take the example of Bahrain. There was an uprising there, peaceful uprising. It was brutally repressed, and the world stood by there. I mean, Saudi Arabia intervened militarily and helped put down the uprising, but should there have been intervention by other powers in support of the protesters? And wouldn't we not want to see an outcome there resembling what we're seeing in Syria today?
Well, absolutely. I would have strongly favored a complete sort of quarantine and rollback of Saudi military intervention, strong condemnation. First of all, I don't think the two situations are comparable from a human rights perspective, because if you count the number of people that were killed in Bahrain, they pale in comparison to what's happened in Syria. But just because we can't solve, Aaron, every single attempt by an authoritarian regime to prevent democratic wishes of their own population from manifesting itself. Just because we couldn't do it in Bahrain doesn't mean we can't or shouldn't do it in other places. So yes, what happened in Bahrain is an atrocity. It's completely, I think, morally unacceptable. The sad reality, though, in terms of the geopolitical sort of strategic influence that Bahrain has in the Middle East versus Syria, there's very little comparison. I mean, the ripple effects of the conflict in Syria have destabilized not just the Middle East, but they've spread globally. So in that sense, those conflicts are very different.
Right. Okay.
And Nader says we couldn't do it in Bahrain, that we just simply couldn't do it. It's because
we should have done it.
We didn't want to do it because we have a naval base there. We wanted to do it in Syria. We wanted to destabilize.
I'm not apologizing for U.S. foreign policy.
Sorry. Nader, let's let Max finish. Yeah.
The 1990s to destabilize and topple the government of Syria because it's aligned with Iran and because it supports Hezbollah, which is the only group capable of giving Israel a bloody nose, and which, by the way, just ousted al-Qaeda forces from Arsal. So this is why we're doing this in Syria. And to say that we just simply can't do it in Bahrain is a complete whitewash. Now, I think it is helpful to go back to the roots of the conflict and to also acknowledge this. We can also acknowledge severe Syrian government repression of democratic protesters, but to simply call what happened in 2011 a uprising for democracy and freedom whitewashes the complexities. There were cosmopolitan democratic elements. There were also hardline Islamist elements. There was violence from the beginning, including in Banyas, where an Alawite vendor was slaughtered in the streets, where soldiers were massacred on a bridge. There was violence in Jazeera Shagor. In July 2011, over 80 Syrian soldiers who were simply conscripts were massacred, Where were the weapons coming from? They were coming from Libya through the CIA-managed rat line. We're talking about 2,750 tons of weapons that flowed, thanks to the US, through Turkey, with the help of its Sunni allies, into Syria to wage an all-out war on the state. And this was even before 2012. This is well before Operation Timber Sycamore. This was in the early days of the uprising. We also had various demands from the opposition, including in Banyas. Sheikh Anas Ayrut stood on a balcony above hundreds of opposition protesters and declared that one of the demands, to great cheers from the protesters, was to impose gender segregation in schools and to allow teachers to wear niqab. So there is Islamist elements as well, and that's why it's important to identify what the opposition wanted. There's always been an external opposition that's been posing as this fake government, and now you have Riyad Hijab, who was a former Ba'athist, as the de facto head of the Syrian opposition. He's housed in London, funded by Saudi Arabia. I mean, we never knew exactly what the opposition wanted, but it's been made clear as they've gotten behind, and we've seen the Syrian National Council get behind joint FSA and al-Nusra offensives, including in Alawite towns where Human Rights Watch documented the deliberate killing of entire families. We've seen the Syrian National Council, which is now defunct and was supported by the United States, support those kind of offensives, which were genocidal in nature. So we need to talk about that, and it is helpful to go back. That's what I've been doing this whole time. But at the same time, we need to ask why people have continued to support the Syrian opposition. Why are we still talking about removing the Syrian government? As Vijay Prashad has pointed out really eloquently, there's a constituency for peace in Syria on both sides, but it starts with stabilization and stopping where we are instead of these external plots and programs of subterfuge couched behind hollow human rights rhetoric to enact an agenda that Washington has wanted to do since the 1990s. It's not working. It's made people's lives miserable, helped cause a refugee crisis, and it's time to stop where we are. And I've been saying, just stop the escalation.
Nader Hashemi, Nader, we have to wrap, so this is so final comment goes to you.
Thank you. You know, Max and I have fundamental different readings of the conflict. I mean, his rendition of the early phases of the conflict in Syria was very selective and cherry picking, sort of who was responsible for Let me finish, Max.
Yeah,
Let me finish. For cherry picking, it was the overwhelming thrust of the early year of the uprising in Syria was overwhelmingly peaceful. That's simply reality. But what I think the fundamental disagreement that we have, just in terms of the big picture here, is you somehow seem to believe that we should be thankful that Assad is still around, that he's
Don't put words in my mouth. I haven't put words in your mouth. Don't put words in my mouth.
Can I finish, or is Max going to shout over me every time I try to make a point?
Sorry,
Every
Nader,
time you
go
put
ahead.
words in my mouth, I will interrupt.
Nader, go ahead.
The fundamental difference that I have with Max Blumenthal is he seems to be celebrating the rise of the Assad regime, 500,000 deaths later, and celebrating the fact that he's a force for stabilization. Yeah. I think this is fundamentally a catastrophe. To think that anything good can come out of Assad's reconquest of Syria is wishful thinking, and I think time will simply, prove which side, mine or Max Blumenthal, is right in this equation.
Okay, listen, since Max wanted to cut in, we'll go to a bonus round. Max, 30 seconds, and then Nader, you'll have another 30 seconds, and then we have to end this.
Well, I have no intention of interrupting, but Nader has mischaracterized me as celebrating the outcome of a war that's killed hundreds of thousands of people. That's absolutely not what I'm doing. Now, what we've heard from Nader very clearly is a continued argument for regime change and the partition of Syria, the imperial partition of Syria. He seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, he seems upset that the Syrian government might come back into control of sovereign Syrian territory. We now have US military bases dotted across eastern Syria. Turkey has taken some control in northern Syria, and Al-Qaeda's largest franchise in history, thanks to our intervention, thanks to the proxy war, controls the Idlib government. This is a terrible situation, and history has already vindicated the opponents of regime change.
Nader, go ahead.
the Assad regime is overwhelmingly responsible for what has happened in Syria over the last 6 years. To think that that regime can be a force for stabilization, to quote Max Blumenthal, or that he can be a force for peace, again to quote Max Blumenthal, is simply wishful thinking. And I think anyone who has any knowledge of the conflict in Syria, I think, can clearly see that.
I think you've both laid out your positions very eloquently, and I thank you for doing so with us. Nader Hashemi, director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Denver, his latest book, Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East, and Max Blumenthal, best-selling author, senior editor for Alternet's Grayzone project. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.